Modern economies allocate billions of dollars annually to combat economic disparity, yet intergenerational movement, the ability of a child to out-earn their parents, remains stubbornly stagnant. This stagnation persists because policymakers and analysts routinely conflate three distinct economic concepts: poverty, income inequality, and social mobility. Inequality is often measured by the Gini coefficient, a statistical dispersion metric representing the income distribution of a nation's residents. Poverty and inequality are static measurements. They capture a snapshot of who has what at a specific moment in time. Mobility, however, is a dynamic process. It measures the rate of intergenerational movement over a lifespan. To accurately engineer the American dream, we have to stop optimizing for lagging economic outputs, like a fixed wealth gap, and start quantifying the leading environmental inputs that allow individuals to climb. Treating a lack of mobility merely as an income problem results in pure redistribution policies. These address the immediate lack of cash, but they bypass the environmental frictions that keep individuals from ascending on their own merits. Economists track movement in two distinct ways. The first is absolute mobility. This occurs when an entire generation earns more, usually driven by broad economic expansion. Picture a ladder extending upward. The second is relative mobility, which looks entirely at an individual climbing past others. The gold standard for measuring these ranks comes from economist Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights. They have mapped the income ranks of children compared to their parents with exact precision. But this data presents a specific limitation. It is a lagging indicator. It tells us precisely who moved up or down, but it does not explain the environmental mechanics of why they were able to. To bridge this gap, economists require a new taxonomy, a framework that identifies and measures the invisible environmental barriers preventing individuals from climbing Chetty's ladder. The theoretical bedrock for this taxonomy is the Becker-Tomes model, formulated by Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes. It asserts that intergenerational mobility is largely driven by parental investments and the transmission of endowments from one generation to the next. This model reveals that mobility is determined across a two-stage life cycle, divided broadly into childhood skill development and adult labor market participation. We can plot this against the types of barriers people face. On the y-axis, we have natural barriers. These are individual, familial, or localized constraints, like the degree of parental engagement or family structure during childhood. Conversely, artificial barriers are top-down, externally imposed public policy constraints. These emerge most aggressively during adulthood, manifesting as excessive occupational licensing or restrictive zoning laws that limit labor opportunities. Evaluating true mobility requires measuring all four quadrants simultaneously to assess the total economic and social friction within a local environment. If a state relies heavily on local charity to offset natural barriers in childhood, but leaves restrictive artificial policy barriers intact for its adult workforce, the structural trap preventing upward movement remains closed. The Archbridge Institute's Social Mobility Index condenses this matrix into four measurable pillars. The first pillar is entrepreneurship and growth. Pro-growth policies, characterized by low corporate taxes and housing abundance, act as absolute prerequisites for business dynamism. A dynamic market creates the job opportunities and wage gains necessary for initial upward movement. The second pillar measures institutions and the rule of law. This tracks how predatory state actions, such as aggressive local government fines or the overuse of civil asset forfeiture, disproportionately extract wealth from the poorest citizens. Strong, impartial legal institutions prevent cronyism. They ensure that financial success is determined by market skill and effort, rather than political connections and bureaucratic maneuvering. A booming aggregate economy yields little social mobility if weak institutions and predatory laws artificially exclude vulnerable citizens from participating in that growth. The third pillar is education and skills development, which expands the measurement beyond standard debates over public school funding to include the environments where children actually learn. Research by economists James Heckman and Melissa Kearney demonstrates that family structure, specifically the presence of a two-parent household, is a massive natural driver for early cognitive and soft skill development. Finally, the fourth and final pillar evaluates the power of social capital. Here, researchers differentiate between network cohesiveness, which bonds similar socioeconomic groups together, and economic connectedness, which builds vital bridges across different socioeconomic lines. High bridging social capital reduces economic transaction costs and provides an agile, non-governmental safety net against sudden financial shocks. Without the foundational skills built at home and the bridging connections found in a healthy community, adult labor market opportunities remain permanently out of reach. To see how well these 4 environmental inputs predict real-world mobility, we can cross-reference the Archbridge Index scores against actual economic outcomes across the 50 states. This chart plots the index against Chetty's absolute mobility data. As the environmental score increases, so does the expected income rank of someone born in the 25th percentile, forming a clear, positive upward trend line. States that score highly on these 4 pillars reliably produce children who out-earn their parents. Looking at relative mobility, the slope flips. High index scores correlate tightly with lower intergenerational income persistence, meaning parental wealth dictates child outcomes far less in these environments. Finally, this chart plots the index against the official census poverty rate. The data clusters tightly along a steep downward trajectory. The R-squared value on this plot is 0.52. An R-squared value measures the proportion of the variance for a dependent variable, here poverty, that is explained by the independent variable. Finding that over 50% of state-level poverty corresponds with these specific environmental pillars indicates they are a primary driver of economic stagnation. While no single model accounts for every factor in a complex economy, tracking these specific inputs mathematically identifies the areas of highest friction in the mobility lifecycle. When we map the 2025 state rankings based purely on their structural capacity to foster social mobility, a stark geographic reality emerges. The top of the index is heavily clustered in the Mountain West region. States like Utah, Vermont, and Montana provide the optimal structural environment for the American dream. These top states succeed because they optimize for low artificial barriers, sustaining high business dynamism, while simultaneously maintaining robust natural support systems with exceptionally high social capital. Conversely, the bottom tier is concentrated in the Deep South. States including Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama severely lag the rest of the country. Geography acts as destiny here only because of specific local policies. The lowest-ranking states suffer from compounded, measurable failures in both their institutional rule of law and basic human capital development. This returns us to the initial paradox: why massive, high-budget policy interventions often fail to significantly alter the rate of intergenerational movement. Focusing exclusively on the wealth gap via redistribution targets the current financial result, rather than the structural barriers that produced it. Effective reform requires actively dismantling the artificial barriers, like excessive zoning laws, burdensome occupational licensing, and regressive taxation that currently choke the labor market. Simultaneously, states must foster community environments where natural barriers are mitigated, places where 2-parent families and bridging social networks are highly supported. The data suggests that upward mobility behaves more like a structural output than a random stroke of economic luck. Engineering higher rates of opportunity depends on a state's willingness to strengthen its foundational pillars.